This comparative study seeks to explore the contextual factors that have led to the different representation of the character of the private investigator in the genres of noir and neo-noir, ultimately to discern the differences and similarities. For this study, I will be comparing the noir film The Big Sleep, directed by Howard Hawks in 1946, and Chinatown, a neo-noir film directed by Roman Polanski in 1974. I chose these two films because they are two representatives of the noir genre that were heavily influenced by the respective historical context, two factors that can very well shine a light on the transition between noir and neo-noir. However, before delving into the analysis, it is first important to define what the noir genre is. Although it's hard to determine when it began and when it ended, critics tend to situate classic noir from 1941 to 1958, which, not coincidentally, lasts from America's involvement in the Second World War to the immediate years that followed. As Hans Schugel states, the ethical questions raised by the war and existential doubts were treated on two different levels: on an official, national one which signaled approval, and an individual, psychological one which expressed fear and rejection. This is a dichotomy that will be revisited later on in relationship to the private investigator. On a thematical level, we often see both in noir and neo-noir the moral ambiguities, alienation, and existential absurdity that the characters face, whereas cinematographically, there is often the opposition of light and shadow, oblique camera angles, and disruptive compositional balance of the frames and scenes. The reason I chose to explore noir in contraposition to neo-noir is the underlying exploration of how a genre that was born out of a particular historical condition can be adapted continually to the affairs of the present without losing its essential qualities. This is precisely the framework used for the following analysis. By considering the context of both films, conclusions can be drawn about which artistic choices have remained static and which have been adapted to be more meaningful to the audience of its time, of course in relationship to the representation of the private detective. In The Big Sleep, the story revolves around private detective Marlowe who, after being hired by a millionaire to find his extortioner, begins to realize that the case is far more complex as it involves the daughters of his new boss and other figures that complicates the case later on. The film Chinatown follows a private detective named Jake Gittes, who operates in Los Angeles, a city where crime often goes unpunished as a result of the striking corruption of the police department and the system as a whole. The storyline revolves around a case of infidelity which Gittes is asked to explore. However, it progressively unfolds into a bigger situation that involves a large corruption scheme to buy a large section of land. The figure of the private detective, which is the centerpiece of this analysis, is a notable trope of the noir genre, and in the case of The Big Sleep, it is clear how it was shaped by the post-war years of the United States, where its citizens had trouble coming to terms with the transition from war to normal society. The core of the character of Marlowe is that he essentially sees his society as having failed. Thus, the moral ambiguity he exhibits throughout the film is inextricably linked with him coming to terms with a social structure that once held a great promise and now it has been betrayed. On the other hand, in the film Chinatown, what's notable in relationship to the representation of the private detective is the emergence of a discernible set of values. The 70s, when the film was shot, were characterized by the minorities' fight for equality and, more significantly, the fight against the ongoing war in Vietnam. The neo-noir manifests the fact that its historical context, which is still ongoing, presents a detached and clear vision of how the characters deal with the themes that the classic noir often left unresolved, such as the war and the American dream. This once again manifests itself in the neo-noir private detective, Jake Gittes, whose aims and morale is clearer than Marlowe's. Although there are particular traits that are shared by both detectives, such as the unrestrained use of violence, Chinatown's context had a radically different effect on the character of the detective. In this case, there was a reivindication of the idea of fighting for a social cause, as opposed to the idea of an inevitable broken society, as in the case of The Big Sleep. In essence, what produces the rupture between noir and neo-noir is a degree of self-reflexivity that is more present in the former. In terms of film elements, the pessimist attitude of the classic noir private detective is most evidently seen in The Big Sleep when it makes use of three particular film elements: dialogue and the alternating use of low-lit and high-lit scenes. In contrast, Chinatown illustrates the neo-noir private detective's reflexive attitude towards society through the use of lighting, wide shots, and facial expressions. Throughout The Big Sleep, the detective's dialogues are typically wisecracks, which ridicule the situation and sometimes even himself. This emphasizes the fact that the way he dismisses the importance of the events he is presented with represents on a grander scale his disbelief of the possibility of a functioning society. Furthermore, when his witty dialogues are directed toward himself, it paradoxically signifies that he also thinks of himself as unworthy of belonging to a functioning society. This is clearly seen in dialogue between Carmen Sternwood and Marlowe.
You're not very tall, are you?
Well, I tried to be.
Where his dialogue represents an internal struggle to measure up to the standards of society. In Chinatown, however, the use of a wider range of facial expressions as applied to Jake Gittes illustrates how his position in society is no longer characterized by the struggle to come to terms with society. Marlowe rarely deviates from his serious demeanor, whereas Gittes' expressions are in a constant flux. They represent the feelings of the character, from stressed out to sheer happiness. Ultimately, this reinforces the idea once again that the neo-noir private investigator has effectively broken away from the past and can express emotion, which is almost never the case with The Big Sleep. The idea of Marlowe being torn apart between rejecting the values of society and also aspiring to live by them is illustrated through the use of lighting. Detective Marlowe is constantly illuminated with varying degrees of brightness, and it is not a coincidence that more often than not, how the scene is lit is a representation of the internal conditions of the character. For instance, when Marlowe's scenes are low lit, it is a manifestation of the historical context, since it conveys the idea of a clouded moral compass and thus the character's distancing from aspiring to be virtuous. This is an important point because when a scene is strikingly high lit, it signifies that the character has found a resolution not only to the part of external conflict but of the internal one too. In contrast, as a means to break from the claustrophobic chiaroscuro that predominated many films of the classic noir genre, Chinatown develops the narrative through the use of generally well-lit scenes. This warrants the interpretation that the private detective is no longer one who dwells on the past, but one who accepts the malfunctionings of the present and visions a relatively better future. In conjunction with this, Polanski's use of the wide shot furthers this idea by illustrating how Gittes does not have to move through the confined environments that Marlowe had to. The private investigator of the neo-noir is subject to a more expansive perspective of what the world is. Now that both films have been considered, it is clear that, although the narrative structure has remained the same, the thematic content of the neo-noir has evolved from the classical one to be able to embody the problems that are of relevance to the present. This is a significant matter because it tells us that film as an art form is fundamentally endless in terms of possibilities. As we have seen, genres are in a constant state of adapting, which conclusively tells us that as long as there is conflict in our lives, be it a petty fight or a large-scale war, film will always be at our disposal as a tool to explore what troubles us as individuals in a society.